Hey everyone, Noir here. Let's get into today's Reddit story.
My brother texted our parents, "Treat us fairly," after I stopped coming around because they refused to help me when I lost my job. I replied, "You paid 6 months of his rent, but all I got was a lecture about being independent." That was the night I finally realized my parents had already chosen which one of us mattered more. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom at 32 years old, staring up at the ceiling fan that still made the same faint clicking sound it had when I was a teenager. It felt strangely comforting, but in a sad kind of way. The same room, the same sound, but a completely different version of me. Broke, unemployed, and somehow expected to get back on my feet, as if none of this was a big deal. Everything really began with one sentence my dad casually said over speakerphone. He said it so casually, as though it meant nothing. As though those words weren't about to quietly change the way I looked at my family forever. I had lost my job 2 weeks earlier. I wasn't fired because I had done something wrong, and I wasn't laid off because the company had suddenly gone under. In some ways, it felt even worse because it happened so quietly. The company restructured, new leadership stepped in, and my position was no longer considered part of their future plans. I read that email 3 separate times before the truth finally hit me. I remember sitting there after the phone call ended, staring at my laptop, almost expecting another message to appear, saying there had been some mistake. It never came. There was only silence, followed by the realization that rent still had to be paid, groceries still cost money, and my health insurance didn't care what I was going through. I didn't call my parents immediately. Pride was probably the biggest reason. I had always been the independent one, not in the way they proudly talked about, but in the sense that I rarely asked anyone for help. I moved out young, paid for most of my own college, accepted whatever work I could get after graduation, and slowly built my career on my own. No drama, no big favors. My younger brother Tyler was the complete opposite. He was loud, impulsive, and somehow always caught up in another financial disaster that everyone else rushed to solve. My parents called him spirited. I called him exhausting. Somehow his problems were always treated like emergencies, while mine were always seen as something I could manage by myself. When I finally called my parents, it was only after I had gone over my finances at least 6 different times and realized I probably had no more than 2 months before things became a real problem. My mom was smiling from ear to ear. Tyler leaned back in his chair with his hands behind his head, like he'd accomplished something incredible himself. They talked about it openly and proudly. The amount of money, the relief, how good it felt to get him back on his feet. Nobody even looked at me. I sat there with my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, doing the math in my head. The same parents who had told me I'd bounce back had just written a check large enough to erase all of my brother's mistakes. The same parents who hadn't offered me even a single month of help were celebrating a rescue they never questioned for a second. I smiled. I even congratulated Tyler. What else was I supposed to do? But something inside me went very quiet in that moment. I wasn't angry yet, just clear-headed. They had been right about one thing. I was going to bounce back, just not in the way they expected. I didn't say anything that night. I went home, laid awake in the dark, and replayed that dinner over and over in my head. Every word, every laugh, every casual assumption that I'd be fine because I always had been. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, a thought settled into my mind. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. If they were never going to see me as someone worth stepping in for, then I needed to stop acting like I was still waiting for them to. The next morning, I made a decision, then another, then another. Small choices at first. Each one felt like quietly stacking kindling piece by piece. No speeches, no arguments, no confrontation. Just preparation. I was done asking for help from people who only liked helping when it made them feel like heroes. I didn't confront them after that dinner. I didn't send a long message, and I didn't make some dramatic exit. From the outside, everything looked the same. I still went to family gatherings. I still answered their calls. I still played my part. But internally, something had changed. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped giving updates unless someone directly asked. I told myself I was protecting my energy, but the truth was simpler. I was paying attention. The weeks after that dinner were some of the hardest of my life. The job market stayed brutal. Interviews came and went. Some companies disappeared after 3 rounds like I had never existed. Others sent polite rejection emails that all sounded identical, except for the logo at the top. Every morning, I woke up with that familiar weight sitting in my chest, the kind that hits before you even remember why you're anxious. I tracked every dollar. I skipped more meals than I should have. I kept telling myself it was temporary. I kept telling myself I was still capable. I just needed more time. Meanwhile, my parents seemed happier than ever. Helping Tyler had given them energy. Every conversation somehow came back to him, how relieved he was, how motivated he seemed, how this fresh start was exactly what he needed. They talked as if they had made a smart investment, like they had backed the right person and were already seeing results. One afternoon, my mom called while I was sitting in my car, outside a coffee shop I couldn't really afford but needed because of the Wi-Fi. She asked how things were going. I hesitated for a moment before telling the truth. "Still looking," I said. "It's been rough." She made a sympathetic sound. "Well, these things happen for a reason." I waited. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't ask how I was getting by. Instead, she changed the subject. "Oh, by the way," she said casually, "Tyler is thinking about moving closer to us. He's talking about starting over." I stared at the dashboard with my hand tight around my phone. "That's great," I said. "We might help him with a deposit," she added, "just to make sure he lands on his feet." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I stayed quiet, and she filled the silence with reassurance that sounded more like it was meant for herself. "It's different with you, Ethan. You've always been so self-sufficient." There it was, the compliment that felt more like a punishment. That night, I checked my bank account again and realized I had exactly 26 days before rent became a serious problem. I thought about calling my parents back, really calling them, telling them I wasn't okay, telling them I needed help, telling them that their faith in my resilience was starting to feel a lot more like neglect. I never made the call. Part of me wanted to see how far they would let things go. The breaking point didn't happen all at once. It came in layers, small moments that kept cutting deeper until something finally gave way. It started when my dad asked me to help Tyler. We were back at my parents' house again, this time celebrating my mom's birthday. Cake, coffee, the usual routine. Tyler was excitedly talking about his new plans, waving his fork around like he was giving a presentation. In the middle of the conversation, my dad turned to me. "Hey, Ethan," he said, "you're good with numbers. Think you could help Tyler make a budget to keep him on track?" I blinked. "A budget?" "Yeah," my dad said, "since he's getting a fresh start." I wanted to ask, what about my life made me look like a financial advisor? I wanted to ask if anyone in that room remembered I was unemployed. Instead, I slowly nodded. "Sure," I said, "I'll take a look." Tyler smiled. "See? I told you he'd help." That evening, he emailed me all of his financial information. Looking through those numbers felt almost unreal. The debts my parents had completely erased, the financial cushion they had given him, and monthly expenses that were somehow higher than mine had ever been, even when I still had a job. At the bottom of the spreadsheet was a short note. "Mom and Dad said you'd know what to do." I closed my laptop and sat there in silence for a long time. It felt like everyone else was in on the joke except me. A few days later, my mom called and asked if I could watch their dog while they went away for the weekend. "Just 2 nights," she said. "You don't really have much going on right now anyway, do you?" That hit harder than it probably should have. Not because she asked me for a favor, but because of how casually she brushed off my situation. It was like losing my job had turned me into someone with endless free time, someone who had no real responsibilities because he wasn't working. I agreed. Again. The real betrayal, the one that still makes my chest tighten whenever I think about it, came about 2 weeks later. I got an email from my landlord with a subject line notice. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. It wasn't an eviction notice yet, but it was close enough to make my hands shake. I needed help. Not advice, not encouragement. Real financial help. So I called my parents. This time, I didn't soften the truth. I told them exactly where I stood. I explained the notice from my landlord. I admitted I needed temporary help, just enough to get through until I found another job. I could hear my own voice shaking, and I hated that, but I forced myself to keep talking. There was a long silence. Too long. Finally, my dad spoke. "Well, Ethan, we've already stretched ourselves pretty thin helping Tyler." My mom quickly added, "We honestly didn't realize things had gotten this bad for you, but you've always been resourceful. You always figure things out." Something inside me finally broke. "So that's it?" I asked quietly. "You can't help me at all?" "It's not that we can't," my dad replied. "It's just not the right time." Not the right time. I thanked them for listening and ended the call before they could hear my voice crack. 2 days later, I found out what "not the right time" really meant. Tyler called, sounding happier than I'd heard him in months. "You're never going to believe this," he said. "Mom and Dad paid my first 6 months of rent up front. They said they wanted to give me some breathing room." I slowly sat down on the edge of my bed, gripping my phone. 6 months? I repeated. "Yeah," he laughed. "They didn't want me worrying about money while I got back on my feet." I didn't answer right away. Completely unaware of what I was thinking, Tyler kept talking about furniture, future plans, and how lucky he felt. When the call finally ended, I just sat there. The difference between the way they treated us was impossible to ignore. The timing, the choice. They hadn't simply refused to help me. They had turned around and immediately chosen him again. That was the moment everything finally became clear. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't because they didn't know. It was a pattern they were completely comfortable with, a pattern they expected me to accept quietly, just like I always had. I got up, walked over to my closet, and started pulling out old boxes I hadn't opened in years. Old documents, notes, random papers I had kept without ever thinking I'd need them. Somewhere in the middle of sorting through everything, I realized I wasn't searching for comfort anymore. I was searching for leverage. Then one memory suddenly came back to me. A conversation from years earlier, a promise my parents had casually made, something they probably assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I sat there on the floor surrounded by papers, feeling hurt, but also strangely clear-headed. This wasn't only about money anymore. It was about respect, about being invisible until someone needed something from me. For the first time since losing my job, I wasn't thinking about how I was going to survive another month. I was wondering just how deep all of this really went. The truth about hitting rock bottom is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There isn't one huge crash. There isn't a movie scene where everything falls apart in a single moment. It's much quieter than that. It's a slow process, a collection of small losses that keep piling up until one morning you wake up and realize you've become someone you barely recognize. For me, rock bottom arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Tyler told me our parents had paid 6 months of his rent. I woke up to another email from my landlord asking if I had reviewed the notice. The polite wording somehow made it even worse. It was like he was giving me permission to pretend things weren't serious yet. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that made every breath feel a little too shallow. I ran the numbers again, even though I already knew nothing had changed. I still didn't have enough. That day I spent hours walking with no destination in mind. I just needed to keep moving because sitting still felt impossible. I passed cafes where I used to work on my laptop. I walked by stores I used to browse during lunch breaks, back when I actually had a lunch break. Everything around me looked exactly the same, and somehow that made it hurt even more, like the world hadn't noticed I was slowly falling behind. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a friend I hadn't really kept in touch with since college, not because I needed money, but because I needed someone to talk to. I didn't even tell him the whole story. I just admitted I was going through a hard time. He listened without trying to solve my problems or brush them aside. After we hung up, I realized how much I'd been craving that simple feeling of being understood. The following week was brutal. I sold more of my belongings, this time things I actually cared about. I cut my spending down to almost nothing. I stopped telling myself I was just between jobs and finally admitted that I was struggling. That small shift mattered more than I expected. Once I stopped lying to myself, I could finally think straight. I never told my parents any of it, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I already knew how that conversation would end. Encouragement without help. Pride without support. I couldn't handle another disappointment like that. My lowest point came late one night while I was packing more boxes, trying to decide what I could sell next. I sat on the floor surrounded by half-filled boxes and felt completely hollow. Not sad, not angry, just empty. Like everything that had kept me going had finally run out. I remember thinking that if I stayed in that place too long, it would swallow me. So I did something small, something almost ridiculously simple. I opened my laptop and made a list, not of jobs I wanted, but of things I could actually do right then. My skills, the experience I'd overlooked, the people I'd been too proud to contact. At first, the list didn't look like much. It didn't magically solve anything, but it was real. It belonged to me. And for the first time in weeks, I had something to focus on besides simply surviving. I quietly started reaching out. No announcements, no social media posts about exciting new beginnings. I emailed former coworkers, old clients, and people I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for conversations, advice, temporary work, anything. Some people never replied. Others did. One conversation turned into a small freelance project. It paid less than I hoped, but it paid. More importantly, it reminded me that I still had value. I wasn't broken. I was just bruised. I threw myself into that project, working nights and weekends. I treated that small project like it was the most important thing in the world, because, in a way, it was. It proved I wasn't finished yet. During all of this, my parents barely checked in. And when they did, the conversation stayed superficial. Any updates? Still looking? My answers became shorter. Not because I was bitter, but because I was done explaining my struggle to people who only listened when it was convenient. Meanwhile, Tyler seemed to be doing great, or at least he looked like he was. New furniture, new plants, photos of his fully furnished apartment filling the family group chat, all thanks to my parents' generosity. Everyone reacted with hearts and excited comments. Eventually, I muted the chat. As the weeks passed, that first freelance project turned into a second, then a third. Nothing steady yet, but it was momentum, the kind that builds quietly while you're too busy working to notice. I started waking up with purpose again. Not optimism, purpose. There's a difference. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't obsessively checked my bank account in several days. That realization hit me harder than any rejection email ever had. It meant I wasn't living in panic anymore. I was making plans. I paid my landlord part of what I owed and worked out more time for the rest. It wasn't perfect, but it bought me something valuable. Time to think, time to breathe, time to keep building. What surprised me most during that period wasn't the work. It was the change happening inside me. Somewhere along the way, the pain I'd been carrying because of my parents started changing. It didn't disappear, but it became sharper, clearer, and less emotional. I stopped asking why they treated Tyler differently and accepted that they always had. That realization hurt, but it also set me free. I stopped trying to earn fairness. I stopped believing that if I explained myself better, they'd finally understand. I began to realize their view of me had never changed. Reliable, resilient, independent. The son who didn't need help because he never asked loudly enough. So I stopped asking. As work slowly picked up, I noticed something else, a pattern I'd ignored for years. I'd quietly been the family support system more often than I'd realized, helping my parents with technology, reviewing paperwork, giving advice, and stepping in whenever something needed to be handled calmly and responsibly. I'd always done those things without keeping score because I believed respect went both ways. Looking back, I could finally see the truth. They never saw my help as a sacrifice. They simply saw it as expected. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me think differently. By the third month, I wasn't fully back on my feet, but I wasn't drowning anymore. I'd found a routine, my client list was growing, and I finally felt a level of control I hadn't experienced in a long time. I even started putting a little money aside again. It wasn't much, but it reminded me that I was finally moving forward. My parents noticed the change before I ever mentioned it. My mom said I sounded happier on the phone. My dad commented that I seemed more confident. They never asked why. They never asked how. By then, it didn't matter. I wasn't rebuilding my life for them anymore. I was rebuilding it quietly, deliberately, with every lesson I'd learned guiding me. And through it all, that conversation from years earlier stayed in the back of my mind. That promise they assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. As my footing became steadier and my confidence returned, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding my finances. I was building independence, the kind that didn't depend on their approval or recognition. I wasn't ready to act on any of it yet, not even close. But for the first time since losing my job, I could finally see a future that didn't end with me begging for scraps of validation. I wasn't at the top yet, but I was no longer at the bottom either. And the farther I climbed on my own, the more obvious it became that the next chapter wouldn't be about surviving. It would be about choosing. Once I stopped waking up in panic, once the fear of everything collapsing faded into something quieter, my thinking began to change in ways I hadn't expected. Not darker, sharper, more focused. It's funny how stability doesn't erase the things that hurt you. It simply gives you enough distance to understand them. At first, I didn't think of what I was doing as revenge. That word felt too dramatic, too emotional. What I was doing felt quieter than that, maybe colder. I started thinking of it as preparation. The first thing I changed was my reactions. I stopped replying to family messages right away. I stopped dropping everything whenever my dad needed a quick favor. I stopped filling awkward silences whenever my mom worried about Tyler. I stayed friendly, polite, neutral, quietly unavailable. They didn't notice at first. They almost never did. Eventually, though, they noticed I had stopped volunteering. When the Wi-Fi went out at my parents' house and Dad asked if I could come fix it, I told him I was busy with work. When Mom wanted me to review paperwork for one of her friends, I said I'd get to it later, and never did. When Tyler asked me to help him make a decision, I told him I trusted his judgment. Every time, there was a pause, confusion. A little frustration, then acceptance. They had always assumed I'd be available whenever they needed me. Turns out I wasn't. Around that same time, work changed too. One of my freelance clients offered me a larger role with more responsibility, and something much closer to long-term work. It wasn't technically full-time, but it was enough to completely change how I planned my weeks. The pay was better. I had more influence, more responsibility. I accepted immediately. That opportunity also gave me something else: access, meetings, conversations, decisions I hadn't been included in before. And when you have access, information naturally follows. I started learning things, not about my family at first, about how systems worked, how money moved, how people justified decisions, how they built stories that made their choices seem unavoidable. It made me realize how often people with resources treated personal preferences like unavoidable necessities. That thought brought me right back to my parents. They hadn't helped Tyler because they had no choice. They helped him because they wanted to, because it fit the story they'd been telling themselves for years. Tyler needed saving. I didn't. The moment I understood that, the last bit of confusion finally disappeared. One evening, while organizing files for work, I found an old folder I'd carried from one computer to another for years. I hadn't opened it in ages. Inside were scanned documents, emails, handwritten notes, and files I'd saved years earlier without really knowing why. Then I found it again. The same thing that had stopped me cold while digging through boxes a few weeks earlier. Years before, when my parents were reorganizing their finances, they had asked me to help. I handled budget projections, account consolidation, and long-term planning. They trusted me because I paid attention to details, because I stayed calm, because they knew I wouldn't judge them. During that process, my dad made an offhand comment, half joking, half serious. "If anything ever happens to us," he said, "you're the one we trust to handle everything." Back then, I heard responsibility. I heard respect. I believed it meant I mattered. Later, there was more. Emails, notes, even a draft document that was never made official but still existed. It was basically a contingency plan, a quiet acknowledgement that, despite everything, I was the dependable one. They assumed I'd forgotten about it because it was never finalized and was never brought up again. Life moved on. Tyler's latest crisis always became the priority, while my reliability slowly faded into the background. But documents don't forget. When I found those files again, I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded, like the last missing piece had finally fallen into place. This wasn't about embarrassing my parents, confronting them, or demanding apologies I already knew I'd never get. It was about timing. From that point on, I paid closer attention during family conversations. Not emotionally, practically. I noticed what worried them, what they assumed was already taken care of, and what responsibilities they casually pushed aside. My mom complained about paperwork piling up. My dad admitted he was overwhelmed by certain financial tasks. Tyler openly talked about plans that depended on my parents continuing to support him financially, as if that was simply guaranteed. No one asked what I thought. That was fine. Around the same time, I quietly started reconnecting with people from my past, former coworkers who had moved into influential positions, friends who had started businesses, old contacts I'd lost touch with while trying to prove I could handle everything alone. I never talked about my family. I never complained. We talked about work, opportunities, and ideas instead. I listened more than I spoke. One conversation led to another. One favor turned into a partnership. Slowly and intentionally, my network began growing in ways I never expected before losing my job. And with every step forward, something else grew too. Distance. The emotional kind. I stopped needing my parents' approval. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, wondering if I should have said something differently. Their choices stopped feeling like wounds and started looking like facts. That's when I knew I was ready, not to act, to position myself. The opportunity I'd been waiting for didn't arrive with fireworks. It showed up disguised as a problem. One evening, my dad called. His voice sounded tense. He wanted advice about restructuring some assets. Nothing urgent, he said, but important. He asked if I had time to talk. I looked at my calendar, at the work I'd built, at the stability I'd created on my own. "I can make time," I told him. As he explained everything, I realized what he was really asking. He still trusted me enough to rely on me whenever something important came up. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't listening as the son desperate to be noticed anymore. I was listening as someone measuring leverage. By the time the call ended, I already knew what I was going to do next. Not immediately, not emotionally, carefully, because the best setups never look like threats. They look like help. The moment I knew it was time didn't come with anger or excitement. It came with paperwork. My dad asked me to stop by on a Saturday morning. He presented it as a favor, the way he always did whenever he needed help, but didn't want to admit it. He said he wanted a second opinion on some documents involving asset restructuring. Nothing dramatic, just organizing things for the future. I remember driving over feeling surprisingly calm. Not numb, calm. The kind of calm that comes after you've already made peace with your decision. My parents' house looked exactly the same as always. The same driveway, the same squeaky front step. The same framed family photos covering the walls, full of smiles, celebrations, and carefully chosen moments that never showed the cracks underneath. Tyler's picture was newer than mine. His frame was bigger too. I noticed it without feeling anything, the same way you'd notice the weather. We sat down at the dining room table with papers neatly spread out in front of us. My dad did most of the talking. My mom stood nearby, adding comments whenever she thought something needed smoothing over. They were stressed, but not worried. They still believed everything was under control. They still believed I was under control. As I read through the paperwork, everything I'd suspected became obvious. Their entire plan depended on one assumption, that I'd always be the quiet, dependable backup. The one who understood the details, the one they could count on whenever something went wrong, the one who would never make things difficult. They had relied on that assumption for years without ever acknowledging it. I set the papers down and looked at my dad. "There's a risk here," I said evenly. He frowned. "What kind of risk?" "The kind that shows up when responsibilities aren't clearly defined," I replied. "You're assuming someone will automatically take care of certain things." My mom nodded. "That's exactly why we wanted your opinion." That was my opening, not a dramatic one, a quiet one. "I'm happy to give you my opinion," I said, "but I'm not going to be the fallback anymore." The room went completely still. My dad blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said calmly, "I've been filling that role for years without it ever being formalized, acknowledged, or supported. I'm not doing it anymore." My mom let out a nervous laugh. "Ethan, this isn't really the time for this." "It is," I said, cutting in gently, "because this entire setup depends on it." They looked at me, confused and a little offended, like I'd crossed a line no one was ever supposed to mention. My dad straightened in his chair. "You're reading too much into this. You've always helped us. We trust you." I nodded. "You trust me to take care of everything. But when I needed help, you didn't support me." Just then Tyler walked in from the kitchen with a cup of coffee, completely unaware of what he'd interrupted. "What's going on?" My dad waved a hand. "Just talking through some logistics." I looked at Tyler for a moment, really looked at him. He seemed relaxed, completely free of worry, protected by decisions that had never really been his to make. "I'm stepping back," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "From all of it." My mom's smile disappeared. "What do you mean, stepping back?" I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails, notes, the old draft, and the contingency language my dad had casually mentioned years earlier, but never made official. I had also included a summary showing just how much of their entire system depended on work I'd been doing quietly and for free. "I'm not officially responsible for any of this," I said, which means I'm no longer willing to keep doing it unofficially. For the first time, my dad's expression changed. Not anger, concern. "You wouldn't seriously walk away," he said. "That would leave us in a difficult position." I met his eyes. "You've left me in difficult positions more than once." The room fell silent. My mom tried again, her voice softer this time. "We didn't realize things had gotten that bad for you." I nodded. "I told you when it mattered. You chose not to hear me." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "This feels a little extreme." I looked directly at him. "So did watching Mom and Dad pay 6 months of your rent while I was trying to avoid eviction." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he had nothing to say. I stood up. "I'm not asking for money," I said. "I'm not asking for apologies either. I'm simply letting you know that I'm not going to be the family safety net anymore. If these responsibilities matter, then they need to be formalized or handed over to professionals. I won't be involved unless there's mutual respect and clear boundaries." My dad's voice tightened. "You're only doing this because you're angry." "No," I answered. "I'm doing this because I bounce back, and I finally understand what I'm worth." Then I walked out. No yelling, no slammed doors. The consequences didn't happen overnight. They came slowly. Within a few weeks, things started slipping through the cracks. Responsibilities were missed. Decisions took longer. The professionals they hired charged money and asked questions my parents had never had to answer before. The convenience they had always counted on was suddenly gone. They called me. I didn't rush to pick up. And when I did answer, I stayed polite, brief, and unavailable. Tyler had the hardest time adjusting. Without my quiet support, his plans started falling apart much faster. Eventually, he called asking for advice. I told him to trust his own judgment, just like everyone had always told me. My parents tried different approaches after that. Guilt, concern, long conversations about family, sacrifice, and responsibility. I listened, but I didn't give in. The real turning point came several months later during another family gathering, smaller this time, more uncomfortable. My dad pulled me aside. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You used to be dependable." "I still am," I said. "Just not for people who depend on me without ever supporting me." He looked exhausted, older than I remembered. A few moments later, my mom joined us, her eyes filled with emotion. We never realized how much we relied on you. I nodded. That's exactly the problem. There was no dramatic apology, no emotional confession, just an acknowledgement. Too late to erase the past, but enough to change what came next. Tyler barely looked at me for the rest of the evening. Driving home, I didn't feel victorious. I felt at peace. Over the following months, my work turned into something permanent. Something even better than the job I'd lost. I moved into a new place, smaller than before. But it was mine, built completely on my own terms. My parents adapted. They had no choice. Our family dynamic changed for good, less comfortable, more honest. As for me, I stopped making myself smaller just to make everyone else comfortable. I didn't walk away with money. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I did something better. I stopped being the invisible support holding together a system that had never truly valued me. They finally understood what I was worth the moment I stopped giving it away. And the funny part is, I really did bounce back, just not in the way they expected.